Hi, this is David Robbins with the Wakanda Technical Services team here in San Jose, and I've been building a custom login scheme for my paid time off application that will be releasing in a few weeks, and I wanted to show you how I did it. It uses a lot of the new security APIs from version 2 of Wakanda. So anyway, to create a custom login scheme, one thing I wanted to do was authenticate users from my own user data class instead of the directory. So to do this, I needed to set a custom login listener on the server, and I'm going to show you how to call that login listener from your own client code and how to use Jquery to show and hide your login and logout elements. So anyway, let's jump into Wakanda and I'll show you how I did it. I'd like to show you the custom login scheme that I'm creating for my PTO application that I'm getting ready for release. So let's look at it. I'm going to launch Wakanda Studio. And let's take a look at the directory. So for my new scheme, I'm going to have one user in the directory. I'm going to have permission groups, and the one user, the admin user, will be a member of the very highest level group. And I'm going to create a user data class for storing my users, and my authentication of the users will be from this class. So you can see I have the ID, which is a unique user ID, a login name, and a password and hash key that I will use to authenticate. So you can see for the password, whenever I set the password, I will also set the hash key with using the directory compute HA1 method. And when I need to validate the password, I will do it from this entity method. So anyway, we are going to take a look at the old scheme, which would be using the login widget. And we are going to take a look at what this does. Basically, on login, I load the user entities, and on logout, I do a query that will unload them. So let's go take a look at how this works right now. So here's the new PTO admin, and I will log in as the admin. You can see that we load the user entity collection. You can see I'm showing here the ID and the hash key. Later we will probably not show this, but anyway, I log out and everything works, but it's not the custom login that I want for this application. So let's go show you how to create a custom login scheme. So I'm going to delete these methods and delete the login widget. So let's go back to our solution manager, and the first thing, let's select our project folder. The first thing we need to do is we're going to create a new JavaScript file. I'm going to call it startup. And this will be a bootstrap file that will run whenever our server starts up for this application. And in here, we're going to use the directory setLoginListener function to create a login listener that will get control whenever we try to do a login. That would be with the login widget or with the login method on the client. And so now that we have that set, let me close this. So now we need to create another folder in our project called scripts. And inside here we'll create a JavaScript file called required.js. And this is where we will put function that was called by the setLoginListener. So the setLoginListener method allows you to set a function to handle login requests for your Wakanda solution. So that way you can do a very custom authentication, and in my case I want to authenticate against the user table or user class. And you could do any kind of authentication scheme that you wanted to. So first of all, the username and password from the login are passed into our method. And the first thing I'm going to go is look at the login name and do a query on my user class. And I'm going to check that. And if I don't find them, then I return false, and I'll just let Wakanda authenticate the user in case they were in the directory. But if I do find them in my user class, then I am going to authenticate the user. So, give me a minute here. So the first thing I'm going to do is use the validate password entity method that I created on the user class and pass in the password. And if I don't get a validation, then I will pass back an error object. So I'll just pick an error number of 1024 and send back a message, invalid login. So that should do it. Okay, but if the user typed in the right password, then basically I want to return an object back, a session object. And first thing I want to do, so in my application, is check the access level from the user entity and find out what group that I want the user to be belong to. And these groups will later be set as permissions against the different data classes. So access level 1 is the highest, and I'll set that to the internal group. And let's just copy this. Okay, access level 2 will be the administrator. Access level 3 will be manager. And access level 4 will be employee. And I can change this scheme as I see fit as I'm developing my application. So now that I have my group, basically I want to return an object, and the properties of this object need to be ID, name, full name, belongs to, and storage. And as part of the storage property, I'm going to return the time. So for ID, I'll return the ID from my user entity. And the name, the name will not be full name. That would be login. There is actually a full name property. I can put my user.fullname here. I'm going to append guest on the front. And last, the storage property, which I could add any properties I want to this property, and then in my session I could access them. For now, I'm just going to put the time.
Okay. I see that here. Okay.
Okay, so that looks like it. That is our custom login listener. We need to stop the server to reload these changes. Okay, Wakanda server. There you go. Now, let's go back into our admin page. And I need a couple of text input for our login name and our password. Okay, well, that looks good. Maybe I'll just copy this one. And set the label password. Okay, let's put a button here. We're signing in. Move that down a little bit. So this looks pretty good. Now we have to put in an event handler when we click the sign in button. And the first thing I have to do is get the values of our two text fields, text input fields. So to do that, I'll use the handy Jquery utility. And if you've watched any of my other screencasts, you've seen me do this before. I'm sure all of you Wakanda programmers out there are very familiar with Jquery. So let me get the IDs of my text inputs. So I use the ID selector and put text field 11. That's a value for the login name. Let me copy this and get the value of the password, which is in text field 12. So now that I have the login name and password, I can call the Wakanda Application Framework directory login by password function and authenticate my user. And of course the authentication will be done by the login listener that we created earlier. Now, the login by password will return true or false. If it returns true, that means the server authenticated the user. So, if we successfully authenticate the user, there's a little bit of housekeeping we want to do. So the first thing I want to do is if they sign in successfully, I want to load the user table. Well, let's go try out what we have so far. Alright, let's start Wakanda server. Our application, you can see we have our custom login dialog, or basically, oh, I think I typed in the wrong password. There we go. Signed in successfully. We loaded our user class into the grid and everything looks good. So we got a little more to do. Next thing is we need to have some way for someone to sign out after they've signed in. So let's go create the objects we need for them to sign out. I'd like an object here to display the username after they sign in, and then also a button for them to sign out. Now I'd like to style this button a little bit so that I can differentiate it from the sign in button. So let me think. Might be a nice idea to put the color and maybe match the background of our page. So wait, best way to do it, I'll just type it here. There we go. That looks nice. Let's put the text, it's white, and maybe make the button a little smaller than the sign-in button. Okay, that's a little too small. Okay, that looks better. Let's align these up a little bit. And maybe move that up a few pixels. Okay, that looks okay. So what we want to do is, if someone has signed in successfully, we want to use Jquery to hide our login widgets and show our elements for doing our sign out. So the first thing I want to do is in the onload event, I want to hide the text field and the button for signing out, and only show those once someone has signed in successfully. So we'll use the Jquery hide function. And next, let's go back into our successful login. And we need to do a little housekeeping here. So the first thing we want to do is set the value of our text field, and I want to put the name of the person who just signed in. So we'll use the Wakanda application framework to get the current user dot full name. So now that we've set that, we want to show that text. We'll use the Jquery CSS command to set the property of the rich text object. We'll set the top CSS property. We'll basically move it up into our header area. then we'll use Jquery again to show our text object. And of course we want to move our Logout button and show it also. And the ID is button 6. And of course, if we're going to show the logout widgets, then we have to hide the login widgets. And we'll do that first. Okay, so let's go set this text field 11, and we have a couple labels. And also a button. Okay, that should do that. Now we have to set an event handler for our logout button, and it will be very similar to our login, except we will use the logout method of the directory object. And basically here we want to hide the logout widgets, objects, and show the login text input and button. Basically about the opposite of what we did. So first of all, let's use Jquery. Set the top property to move the rich text and button down off the screen and hide it. And now let's show our login input and button. So we can grab this code here and just change hide to show. And a little bit of housekeeping. Let's do a query that will basically unload the grid. So ID less than 0 will do that. Not the most elegant way to do it, but good enough for this screencast. Okay. Well, let's go take a look what we have. So let's try to sign in. And there our user entities were loaded. We can see that we have our sign out button. That one label looks like we missed that, the password label. So let's go fix that. Let's inspect that element, make sure we get the ID label 12. So let's check here. Oh, there we go. Label 12. That should fix it. Alright, let's reload the page and try it again. And we'll sign in. Beautiful. We can see who signed in. We have a sign out button. We can sign out. And there you go. We have a custom login scheme that looks the way that I want it to look.